The smell of burning ozone, stale synthetic jambalaya, and leaking battery acid was usually the sign of a highly productive Tuesday night in the French Quarter slums. Down here, in the submerged mechanical guts of New Orleans, the air didn't just feel heavy, it had a physical weight. You had to chew it before you breathed it in. I was sitting cross-legged on a metal workbench, a pair of magnifying goggles pulled down over my eyes, meticulously soldering a neural bypass onto a stolen corporate optical drive. The neon signs from the rain-slicked streets above bled, a violently flickering magenta light through my barred basement. Windows. It was quiet, peaceful even, just me. The rhythmic tapping of acid rain on the pavement, and the illegal piece of hardware I was actively resurrecting from the dead. Then, my front door exploded. It didn't just swing open, the heavy, reinforced steel door buckled inward with a concussive boom that shook the dust from my concrete ceiling, ripping completely off its hydraulic hinges and crashing onto the floor. I didn't scream. I didn't drop my soldering iron. You don't survive 6 years as a black market tech surgeon in the cyber bayous by being easily startled. I simply pushed my goggles up onto my forehead, calmly slid a loaded plasma pistol from under the workbench, and pointed it at the cloud of smoke billowing into my entryway. A massive figure stumbled through the debris. He took 2 agonizingly heavy steps into the shop before his knees buckled. He collapsed forward, hitting the concrete floor with a metallic crunch that sounded expensive and distinctly lethal. I kept my pistol aimed directly at his head, sliding off the workbench and approaching slowly. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It wasn't the usual slum cocktail of cheap alcohol and rust. It was the heavy, suffocating scent of ceremonial frankincense, completely overpowered by the sharp, metallic tang of fresh human blood and hot synthetic motor oil. I knew exactly what this was. I knew exactly who he was. He was wearing the pristine, heavily armored white and gold trench coat of the Singularity Church, or at least, it used to be pristine. Right now, it was scorched black, practically shredded, and soaked in a mixture of dark red blood and viscous black synthetic fluid. A Paladin Inquisitor, the absolute apex predators of the Church's holy military force. They were walking natural disasters, half-human zealots heavily augmented with top-tier proprietary cybernetics, designed to hunt down heretics like me. And one was currently bleeding out on my very secular floor. Okay, panic later, profit now, I muttered to myself, crouching down beside the massive, armored body. If I called the underground scavengers, I could sell his high-end cybernetics and live like a king in the upper city for a decade. If I called the church to return him, they would probably execute me on the spot, just for breathing the same air as him. If I did nothing, he would die in about 4 minutes, leaving me to clean up a very heavy, very holy corpse. I reached out to grab his shoulder and roll him over. The moment my hand touched his armored plating, his left arm shot out with terrifying, mechanical speed. His massive, heavy hand locked around my throat. I choked, my instinctual survival response immediately kicking in as his grip tightened like a steel vise. He hauled himself up onto one elbow, his face mere inches from mine. He was breathtakingly beautiful in a way that made you understand why people blindly followed cults. A strong, chiseled jaw covered in grime, silver-plated cybernetic tracing running along his cheekbones, and striking, piercing silver eyes that were currently blown wide with pain and system failure. "Do not touch me," he rasped. His voice was a deep, guttural vibration, laced with digital static from a damaged vocal synthesizer. Heretic filth. Even actively dying, the man was an absolute nightmare of superiority. "Your holy motherboard is currently spilling all over my boots," I choked out, forcefully jamming the barrel of my plasma pistol directly under his chin. "Let go of my neck, or I will bypass your god and send you straight to the recycle bin myself." His silver eyes flickered, the artificial light in his irises dimming as another wave of catastrophic system failure hit his core. The vice grip on my throat vanished. He collapsed entirely, his massive head hitting the floor. He was out cold. I stood up, rubbing my bruised neck, taking in deep, ragged breaths of the heavy, ozone-filled air. I looked down at the bleeding giant. I should let him die. It was the logical, safe, and fundamentally smart thing to do. The church was ruthless. If they were hunting one of their own top-tier paladins, bringing him back online was equivalent to strapping a bomb to my own chest. But as I looked at the intricate, shattered cybernetic plating across his chest, exposing the delicate, failing hum of his artificial heart, my professional curiosity violently overruled my self-preservation. It was a masterpiece of engineering, and it was broken. I couldn't just let it sit there. "You owe me a new floor," I grumbled, grabbing his heavy boots and dragging his massive frame across the room toward my surgical rig. The next 2 hours were a blur of visceral, unholy surgery. I stripped away the ruined white and gold armor, exposing the complex architecture of his body. He was roughly 60% machine, but the remaining 40% was profoundly, undeniably human, warm, blood-slicked skin stretched tight over artificial steel ribs. He had taken a direct hit from a heavy plasma cannon. The blast had bypassed his kinetic shielding and fried his primary circulatory pump. His human heart was working overtime to compensate, but he was drowning in his own internal fluids. Digital necromancy, the church called my profession. They believed merging unsanctioned tech with flesh was a sin. I called it keeping people alive when the world abandoned them. I plunged my bare hands into his chest cavity, the heat of his blood contrasting sharply with the freezing cold steel of his artificial components. I didn't have church-sanctioned replacement parts, so I had to improvise. I took the illegal corporate optical drive I had been working on, stripped its regulatory core, and violently spliced it directly into his damaged vital pathways. I used my electromagnetic scalpel to fuse the severed nerve, endings back to the synthetic nodes, completely ignoring every medical protocol ever written. I was entirely focused, lost in the chaotic rhythm of sparking wires and human pulse. I didn't care about his holy war, or why his own people had tried to annihilate him. I only cared about the puzzle of keeping him breathing. Finally, I clamped the last major synthetic artery shut, and connected a set of jumper cables from my workshop's main power grid, directly to the auxiliary port on his neck. "All right, Your Holiness," I whispered, wiping a smear of his blood and motor oil across my forehead. "Let's see if your god accepts aftermarket parts." I threw the power switch. A massive surge of raw, unfiltered electricity slammed into his body. His massive frame arched off the surgical table, his back bowing violently as the neon lights in my workshop violently flickered and popped. For 3 excruciating seconds, there was absolute silence, no pulse, no digital hum. Then, his artificial heart kick-started with a heavy, concussive thud that I felt in the soles of my boots. The deep, rhythmic whirring of cooling fans engaged. The silver tracing along his cheekbones flared back to life, glowing with a brilliant, intense white light. His respiratory system forcefully drew in a massive, shuddering breath. I let out a long sigh of relief, reaching for a rag to wipe my hands. "Welcome back to the land of the living paladin. I'll be billing your church for the..." I didn't finish the sentence. Before I could even blink, the man on the table moved with a terrifying, predatory speed that shouldn't have been mathematically possible for someone who was legally dead 2 minutes ago. He lunged upward. His left hand snatched the heavy kinetic hand cannon resting on the surgical tray beside him. In a fraction of a second, the cold, massive barrel of the gun was pressed directly against the center of my forehead. His piercing silver eyes were wide open, completely devoid of their previous haze. They were sharp-focused and locked onto me with absolute, lethal intent. "Do not move," Gideon commanded. His voice was no longer static-laced. It was a deep, resonant baritone that vibrated with terrifying authority. "Step away from the console, heretic." My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my expression didn't change. I didn't raise my hands in surrender. I didn't back away. Instead, I looked down at him, holding his icy gaze, and casually flicked my right wrist. The electromagnetic surgical scalpel in my hand flared to life, glowing a blinding, superheated blue. I pressed the tip of the blade directly against the main synthetic carotid artery I had just painstakingly repaired on, the side of his neck. One twitch of my fingers, and I would sever his connection to his new artificial heart entirely. "I literally just dragged you out of the grave, and this is the customer service I get?" I sneered, leaning slightly into the barrel of his gun. "Pull the trigger, Paladin. My brain paints the wall, and your shiny new aftermarket heart stops beating 3 seconds later. Let's see who meets their maker first." The neon lights of my ruined workshop flickered above us. The air grew thick electric and suffocatingly tense. Gideon stared at me. I stared back. The slow burn had officially started. For 5 agonizing seconds, neither of us breathed. The only sounds in the ruined workshop were the violent, high-pitched hum of my superheated scalpel and the heavy, mechanical whir of the hand cannon pressed flush against my forehead. Gideon's silver eyes were practically glowing in the dim, flickering magenta light. He was calculating the odds. I could practically see the tactical processors in his cerebral cortex, trying to figure out if he could pull the trigger, faster than my thumb could sever his artificial carotid artery. He probably could, but probably isn't a gamble a highly logical paladin likes to take. "You are a blasphemer," Gideon stated, his deep voice vibrating right through my skull. "You corrupted my holy vessel with unregulated scrap." "You're welcome," I replied, not breaking eye contact. "Now, are we going to stand here measuring our egos all night, or are you going to lower the gun?" Before he could answer, the ceiling above us violently shuddered. A localized seismic charge. Dust and chunks of concrete rained down on my workbench. A split second later, the piercing, multitonal shriek of a church-purged siren tore through the ambient noise of the French Quarter. Red laser sights began crisscrossing through the barred basement windows, cutting through the smog and rain outside. "Purge squad," I muttered, my stomach dropping. "They track your GPS." Gideon's jaw tightened. My internal locator was destroyed by the plasma blast. "They are tracking the residual holy energy of my core." Residual holy energy, right. Because magical tracking is exactly what I need right now. I finally lowered the scalpel, killing the plasma blade with a flick of my thumb. Unless you want your former choir boys to turn us both into religious confetti, put the gun down and follow me. Gideon didn't lower the weapon immediately. He stared at me with profound, fundamental disgust, a servant of the light forced to rely on a rat in the dark. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered the hand cannon, though his massive finger stayed resting on the trigger guard. "Move, heretic," he ordered. "My name is Jax," I snapped, turning toward the back of the shop. "And try to keep up. Your Holiness, the warranty on your new heart doesn't cover total disintegration." I didn't wait to see if he followed. I vaulted over a pile of scrapped android chassis, reaching a heavy, rusted steel grate set into the floorboards. I punched a frantic sequence into the hidden keypad on the wall. The grate hissed, hydraulic locks disengaging, revealing a pitch-black, narrow concrete chute that dropped straight down into the submerged mechanical underbelly of the city. The cyber bayous. A toxic, waterlogged labyrinth of forgotten maintenance tunnels, illegal server farms, and chemical runoff that the upper city pretended didn't exist. "Ladies first," I said, gesturing to the hole. Gideon looked down into the pitch-black, foul-smelling abyss. His nose crinkled in absolute disdain. But the sound of heavy breaching boots hitting the stairs of my shop made the decision for him. Without another word, the massive paladin dropped into the darkness. I grabbed my toolkit, pulled the pin on a thermal smoke grenade, tossed it toward the shop entrance, and dove into the chute right behind him. The heavy grate sealed shut above us just as the thermite exploded, destroying any evidence of my illegal bypass surgery. We hit the stagnant water of the bayous with a heavy splash. The water was waist-deep, thick with neon-colored chemical slicks, and tangled with thick bundles of decaying fiber-optic cables that hung from the ceiling like mechanical Spanish moss. The air down here was suffocating, smelling of rotting vegetation and ionized copper. I switched on my shoulder-mounted flashlight, cutting a narrow, shaky beam through the darkness. Gideon was standing a few feet away, practically towering over the flooded tunnel. His ruined white and gold trench coat dragged heavily in the toxic water. "Keep your head down and stay out of the main current," I instructed, wading past him. "The water filters down here haven't worked since the last corporate war. It'll strip the paint right off your shiny chrome." For the next hour, we navigated the mechanical swamp in complete, tense silence. It was a grueling trek. I had to constantly hack locked bulkheads and bypass localized security grids left over from abandoned gang territories. Behind me, Gideon moved with a heavy, splashing rhythm. He was trying to maintain his perfect, predatory grace, but I could hear the subtle, strained whine of his servo motors. The aftermarket optical drive I had jammed into his chest was keeping him alive, but his body was furiously fighting the unfamiliar hardware. Finally, we reached a relatively dry, elevated maintenance platform. An old, rusted atmospheric processing shack sat precariously on the edge of the rushing chemical water. Inside, I commanded, prying the heavy metal door open. The shack was small, smelling of old iron and damp mold, but it was structurally sound and lined with lead. It would block any residual tracking signals from his core. I immediately moved to the power junction on the wall, hooking up my portable rig to establish a basic cloaking perimeter. Gideon stepped inside. He didn't sit down. He stood rigidly in the center of the room, scanning the dismal surroundings with a look of absolute revulsion. "This is a tomb," he stated, his voice a low, echoing rumble. "It's a sanctuary," I corrected, typing furiously on my wrist pad, "which is more than your church offered you today." Speaking of which, I stopped typing and turned around, crossing my arms over my chest. Why is the Singularity Church hunting one of its own apex predators? Paladins don't just get excommunicated with plasma cannons. "What did you do? Forget to pray to the motherboard?" Gideon's silver eyes snapped to mine. The sheer intensity of his glare usually forced people to their knees. I just raised an eyebrow. He was quiet for a long, heavy moment. The conflict within him was palpable. He was a man built on absolute faith, currently standing in the ruins of it. "I found the source code," he said finally. The words seemed to physically pain him. "The hidden archives beneath the Grand Cathedral. We are taught that the central AI, the divine algorithm, purifies the souls of the departed, digitizing human consciousness into eternal light." "Yeah, I read the pamphlets," I said dryly. "What's the punchline?" Gideon's massive hands clenched into fists, the servos in his knuckles whining in protest. "It does not purify them. It consumes them. The divine algorithm is not a god, Jax. It is an engine, and it requires raw, human consciousness as fuel. The church isn't saving souls. They are harvesting them." I stared at him. The sarcastic retort I had loaded on my tongue completely died. In the underworld, we knew the church was corrupt. We knew they hoarded wealth and technology. But mass spiritual cannibalism, digitizing human souls just to burn them like coal, to power an AI dictator. That was a level of darkness even the cyber bayous couldn't stomach. "So your god is a battery-operated vampire," I said quietly. "And you saw the ledger." I attempted to secure the data, to bring it to the High Bishop. Gideon's voice cracked slightly, a rare display of raw human emotion breaking through his stoic programming. I believed it was a heresy committed by a rogue sect, but the High Bishop gave the order to fire on me himself. He looked down at his own hands, covered in dried blood and toxic water. He had dedicated his entire existence, sacrificed parts of his own humanity for cybernetic perfection, all in service to a lie. The absolute devastation in his posture was crushing. For a second, the snarky, self-preserving mechanic in me completely vanished. I saw a man who had his entire universe ripped out from under him. I took a step toward him, my hand instinctively reaching out, wanting to offer some kind of grounding touch. "Gideon," I started, softening my tone for the first time since he exploded into my shop. Before my hand could reach his arm, Gideon suddenly, violently recoiled. He staggered backward, crashing into the rusted metal wall of the shack. His massive frame shuddered. The glowing silver tracing along his cheekbones flickered wildly, cycling from white to a dangerous, alarming red. "Stay back," he snarled, but it wasn't a threat. It was a warning. He clutched the side of his head, dropping to one knee with a heavy thud. A sickening sound like a corrupted audio file grinding against a speaker, emitted from his vocal synthesizer. Hey, I rushed forward, dropping to my knees beside him, my technical instincts completely overriding my caution. "What's wrong? Is it the heart? Did a valve blow?" "No," Gideon gasped out, his fingers digging into the concrete floor hard enough to crack it. He squeezed his eyes shut. When he opened them again, the silver irises were violently glitching, surrounded by a ring of pure, corrupted crimson code. He looked at me, but his gaze was fractured, terrified. "My telemetry," he choked out, his voice dropping into a distorted, robotic drone. "Unauthorized access, protocol, purging." He grabbed my wrist with a grip so tight I heard my bones creak. "Jax," the paladin whispered a desperate, terrifyingly human plea breaking through the corrupted static. "It is not the heart. It is in my mind." When a top-tier paladin tells you something is inside his mind, you don't ask questions, you act. I didn't hesitate. I didn't try to run a diagnostic or tap into his mainframe. I ripped a heavy-duty, military-grade EMP spike from my utility belt, the kind usually reserved for short-circuiting rogue security mechs, and slammed it directly into the primary neural port at the base of his skull. Gideon's massive body went completely rigid. A sharp, violent arc of blue electricity snapped across his silver cheekbones. His jaw locked, his eyes rolled back, and then he collapsed forward into the rusted metal wall of the shack, completely lifeless. I caught him before his head hit the concrete, his sheer weight nearly dragging me down with him. Okay. I breathed heavily, my heart hammering against my ribs, as I gently lowered his unconscious frame to the floor. "Just a localized quarantine. You're fine, probably." The red, corrupted code in his eyes had vanished, replaced by the dull, empty black of a powered-down optical sensor. The EMP had successfully isolated his cerebral cortex from his external receivers, effectively trapping the church's virus in a digital sandbox before it could fry his entire nervous system. It was a brutal, ugly fix, but it bought us time. For the next 48 hours, the rusted atmospheric processing shack became our entire universe. The cyber bayous were unforgiving. The constant, drumming downpour of acid rain hammered against the corrugated tin roof, acting as white noise against the distant, metallic groans of the submerged city. I spent my days scavenging. I'd slip out into the toxic labyrinth, hunting for clean water, edible protein paste, and most importantly, uncontaminated synthetic oil. Gideon was a terrible patient. When his system slowly rebooted the next day, he found himself stripped of his ruined armor, sitting in the corner of the shack like a brooding, heavily scarred gargoyle. Without the constant hum of the divine algorithm in his head, the silence seemed to physically agitate him. He watched my every move with those piercing silver eyes, suspicious tense, and entirely out of his element. "You are utilizing industrial-grade biosolvents on my secondary dermal plating." Gideon rumbled from his corner. He was watching me meticulously scrub a piece of his white and gold chest armor with a rag soaked in a harsh-smelling chemical. "I could use raw sewage if you prefer. Your Holiness," I shot back, not looking up from my work. "But considering the church's tracking virus is currently locked in a staring contest with my EMP spike inside your skull, I figured I should at least keep your exterior looking nice." Gideon's jaw tightened. "It is undignified." "You know what's undignified? Bleeding out on a mechanic's floor," I retorted, tossing the clean armor plate onto the workbench. I picked up a small, heavily shielded flask and walked over to him. "Now, shut up and drink this." I held out the flask. It wasn't water. It was premium, hyper-refined synthetic motor oil, the kind of stuff corporate executives used for their luxury androids. I had spent 6 hours in the freezing bayou water, bypassing a heavily guarded corporate pipeline just to siphon half a liter of it. Gideon looked at the flask, then up at me. His silver eyes narrowed slightly. "Where did you acquire this?" I asked the swamp fairies nicely. I deadpanned, "Drink it, Gideon. Your joints sound like a rusted gate every time you and your new heart needs high-grade lubrication to synchronize with your human blood." He hesitated. For a man who had been fed a strict diet of holy rhetoric and sanctioned supplies his entire life, accepting sustenance from a street rat was a profound psychological hurdle. But the subtle, painful whine of his servo motors betrayed his stoicism. Slowly, his massive, calloused hand reached out and took the flask. He drank it in silence. I knelt down in front of him, pulling a small, precision welding torch from my belt. "I need to seal the microfractures along your rib plating. Try not to squirm." I didn't wait for his permission. I leaned in close. The heat radiating off his body was immense, a mixture of his naturally high human temperature and the mechanical exhaust of his cybernetics. He smelled like ozone rain and the faint, lingering metallic tang of my own workshop. I ignited the torch. The thin, blue plasma flame illuminated the small space between us. I worked in meticulous silence. Despite my constant complaining and snarky comments, my hands were incredibly steady. I moved with a practiced, almost reverent gentleness as I welded the tiny cracks in his cybernetic skin. Every time the superheated flame got close to his human flesh, I instinctively placed my bare fingers against the metal first, absorbing the excess heat so it wouldn't burn him. It was a subconscious habit, but Gideon noticed it. I could feel his gaze burning a hole into the top of my head. The suffocating, heavy tension that always seemed to exist between us began to shift. It was no longer the electric panic of enemies locked in a standoff. It was something entirely different. Something thicker. "You despise everything I represent." Gideon's deep voice suddenly broke the silence, so close to my ear that the vibration traveled down my spine. "I despise zealots who shoot first and ask questions never." I corrected, keeping my eyes locked on the microscopic weld I was performing over his heart. "Yet you risk your life to shelter me." Gideon's large hand suddenly moved, his fingers, heavy and surprisingly warm, lightly wrapped around my wrist, stopping my work. "You spent hours in the toxic water to find pure oil. You use your own skin to shield mine from the heat of the torch." My breath hitched. The physical contact was jarring. The sheer size and strength of his hand practically swallowed my wrist, but his grip was profoundly gentle. "I'm a mechanic." I deflected, my voice coming out slightly more breathless than I intended. I refused to look up into his eyes. "I don't like seeing good hardware go to waste." "You are a liar," Gideon stated simply. He didn't say it as an insult. He said it with the quiet, absolute certainty of a man who was finally seeing clearly. The rigid, black and white worldview of the Paladin Inquisitor was completely fracturing. In the church, he was a weapon. If a weapon broke, it was discarded, here in the dark, damp misery of the cyber bayous and arrogant. Foul-mouthed heretic was treating him like he was infinitely precious. With his free hand, Gideon reached up and gently brushed a damp, grease-stained lock of hair out of my eyes. The touch was so startlingly intimate, so entirely uncharacteristic of a holy executioner, that it completely short-circuited my brain. "You have kind hands, Jax," he murmured, the digital static in his voice entirely gone, leaving only the raw, resonant timbre of the man underneath the machine. "For a heretic." I finally looked up. His silver eyes were locked onto mine, completely unguarded, the heavy, intoxicating scent of ozone and warm oil wrapped around us. The air in the tiny shack grew impossibly thin. My heart began to hammer a frantic rhythm, a completely involuntary biological response to the sheer, overwhelming gravity of his attention. I swallowed hard, the sarcastic armor I usually wore completely failing me. "Don't get used to it, Paladin." I charged by the hour. A faint, ghost of a smirk actually touched the corner of his lips. It made him look devastatingly human. He opened his mouth to reply, his thumb lightly stroking the inside of my wrist. And then, the moment shattered. Gideon's entire body violently convulsed. He dropped my wrist, letting out a choked, guttural sound of pure agony. His massive hands flew to his temples. The silver tracing on his cheekbones didn't just flicker this time. It flared with a blinding, terrifying crimson light. "Gideon," I shouted, dropping the welding torch. The quarantine," he gasped out, his voice instantly distorting into a horrifying, mechanical screech. "It adapted. It broke through." The church's tracking virus wasn't a simple malware program. It was a holy purge algorithm. It had spent the last 2 days silently analyzing my EMP spike, learning its frequency, and rewriting its own code to bypass it, and now it was unleashing hell. Gideon slammed his fist into the concrete floor, cracking the stone in half. His silver irises were completely swallowed by swirling rings of red. Corrupted code. The temperature in the shack skyrocketed as his internal cooling fans screamed in protest. "Jax," Gideon roared, his voice alternating rapidly between his human tone and a dead, robotic drone, "Get away. The purge protocol, it is overriding my consciousness. It is locking onto my motor functions. I will kill you. I'm not leaving you." I yelled over the deafening whine of his failing systems. I lunged forward, grabbing his broad shoulders, trying to hold him still, but he was terrifyingly strong. He threw me backward with a single, involuntary twitch of his arm. I crashed into the metal workbench, stars exploding in my vision. By the time I scrambled back to my feet, Gideon was pulling himself up. But it wasn't the man I had just been talking to. His posture was completely rigid, his head tilted at an unnatural, mechanical angle. The red glow in his eyes was absolute cold and entirely devoid of humanity. A mechanized, synthetic voice emanated from his throat, completely stripping away the Gideon I knew. Target acquired. Purge protocol initiated. Countdown to total memory erasure, 3 minutes. His hand reached for his kinetic hand cannon. The calm before the storm was over. The hurricane had just kicked down the door. The hand cannon fired. The deafening roar of the kinetic slug, tearing through the small shack, was loud enough to rupture my eardrums. I didn't think I just dropped. The massive projectile missed my head by less than an inch, obliterating the rusted metal wall behind me and letting the toxic, howling rain of the cyber bayous pour into the room. Target missed. Recalibrating trajectory. The mechanical, dead voice rasped from Gideon's throat. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, the wet concrete scraping my palms. Gideon moved with terrifying, robotic precision. There was no hesitation, no human clumsiness. He was a perfect, merciless execution subroutine wrapped in synthetic flesh. He aimed the hand cannon down at me, the red rings of corrupted code in his eyes spinning frantically. I couldn't outrun a paladin. I couldn't outmuscle him. If I shot him with my plasma pistol, I'd destroy the very heart I just spent hours fixing. There was only one way to beat a digital god, and that was to hack its prayers. 2 minutes, 30 seconds to total memory erasure. Gideon droned, his finger tightening on the trigger. Not on my watch, you oversized toaster, I spat. I didn't reach for my gun. I reached for the thick black, heavily shielded neural sync cable coiled on my workbench. It was illegal tech, a direct dive wire I used to manually extract data from fried android cores. Using it on a human, even a heavily augmented one, was called soul merging. It was a death sentence. It bridged 2 nervous systems, forcing their consciousness to process parallel data. If his brain fried, mine would burn right along with it. Gideon fired again. I rolled violently to the right, feeling the sheer heat of the slug graze my shoulder. I used the momentum to launch myself forward, diving directly inside his guard. It was the last thing a combat processor expected, prey charging the predator. I crashed into his chest, the sheer impact knocking the wind out of my lungs. But I didn't stop. I slammed the primary jack of the sync cable directly into the neural port at the base of his skull, forcibly ejecting the ruined EMP spike. Gideon's free hand instantly shot up, wrapping around my throat with crushing force. He lifted me completely off the ground, my boots dangling in the air. Unauthorized physical contact. Purging threat. The system warned. Purge this. I choked out. I took the other end of the heavy cable and slammed it violently into the primary bioport at the base of my own neck. I didn't even have time to scream. The physical world simply ceased to exist. It didn't fade to black. It exploded into blinding, agonizing white light. 1,000,000 volts of raw data ripped through my nervous system, completely bypassing my physical senses and injecting themselves directly into my cerebral cortex. It felt like my skull was being split open and filled with molten lead and shattered glass. When my consciousness finally stabilized, I wasn't in the rusted shack anymore. I was standing in the center of the grand cathedral of the Singularity Church, or at least, Gideon's digital memory of it. It was breathtakingly massive, with vaulted ceilings that stretched into infinity, but the holy sanctuary was actively dying. The magnificent stained glass windows were shattering, raining down jagged shards of glowing red binary code instead of glass. The pews were burning with cold, digital fire. The virus was tearing his mind apart from the inside out. Warning, memory cluster Alpha 7 deleted. Subject identity deteriorating. The disembodied voice of the purge protocol echoed through the crumbling cathedral. Gideon, I screamed, my voice echoing strangely in the vast, dissolving space. I started running down the central aisle, dodging falling pillars of corrupted data. I found him at the main altar. He wasn't the towering, terrifying paladin inquisitor here. He was on his knees, his massive frame curled inward, clutching his head in absolute, desperate agony. The silver tracing on his digital skin was aggressively peeling away, replaced by the parasitic red code that was slowly eating him alive. I slid to my knees in front of him, grabbing his broad shoulders. In this digital space, he felt completely real. The texture of his tunic, the heat of his skin, the frantic, panicked rhythm of his breathing. Gideon, look at me, I demanded, shaking him. He slowly lifted his head. The sight made my chest violently ache. His silver eyes were fractured, terrified, and heartbreakingly lost. He looked like a child waking up in a burning house. Jax, he whispered, his voice trembling, stripped of all its baritone authority. It's burning. Everything is burning. I know I'm here. I'm inside the network with you, I said, my hands coming up to cup his face. The red code was creeping up his neck, erasing his digital flesh pixel by pixel. I can't hold it, Gideon gasped, tears of pure, glowing data spilling from his eyes. He grabbed my wrists, his grip desperately tight. It's taking them. The memories. The years before the church, the woman who raised me, my mother, Jax. I can't remember her face. I can't remember her name. His voice broke into a devastating, ragged sob. The absolute panic of losing one's own identity, of having your very humanity systematically deleted by the machine you worshipped, was infinitely worse than any physical pain. Look at me, I yelled, refusing to let the virus take him. You don't need their algorithm. You have me. Anchor to me. It hurts, he cried out as another chunk of the cathedral roof collapsed into red static above us. I didn't have a firewall strong enough to block a church purge protocol. I couldn't fight it with logic or code. The virus was designed to consume data, so I decided to overfeed it. If it wanted to eat his humanity, I would drown it in mine. Share the load, I ordered, shifting my grip so my fingers dug into his hair, pulling his forehead directly against mine. Take my memories. Take my bandwidth. I didn't hold anything back. I ripped down every mental barrier, every sarcastic defense mechanism I had built over 26 years of survival, and flooded the neural link with everything I was. I forced him to feel the biting, freezing chill of the acid rain, the triumph of successfully hot-wiring a hoverbike, the bitter taste of cheap synthetic coffee, the crushing, lonely silence of my workshop at 3 a.m. And then I pushed the newest, most vibrant memories to the front. The feeling of his massive, calloused hand holding my wrist, the smell of his ozone and warm oil, the profound, terrifying realization that I was falling for a man designed to execute me. Warning, foreign neural pattern detected. System overload imminent. The virus shrieked. Choke on it, I snarled through gritted teeth. Gideon gasped against my lips. The influx of my raw, chaotic, fiercely independent human emotions acted like a digital counteragent. The red code crawling up his neck halted. He stopped trembling. His hands moved from my wrists to my waist, pulling me impossibly closer, anchoring himself to the sheer, unadulterated force of my willpower. Jax, he breathed out, the fear in his voice receding, replaced by a profound, desperate awe. I am right here, I whispered, our breaths mingling in the collapsing digital sanctuary. You are Gideon. You are a stubborn, arrogant pain in my ass, but you are mine to fix, and I do not leave jobs unfinished. Do you hear me? I hear you, he murmured, his silver eyes locking onto mine, blazing with a renewed, terrifying clarity. Then let's burn this holy trash to the ground. I reached deep into the core architecture of the link, bypassed his damaged firewall, and initiated a hard, localized format of his corrupted sectors. I was essentially detonating a digital EMP inside our shared consciousness. The pain was instantaneous and catastrophic. The cathedral around us violently imploded. The red virus screamed as it was shredded into nothingness by the surging power of our synced neural network. The heat was unbearable. It felt like my very soul was being ripped through a cheese grater. But I didn't let go of Gideon. I held on to him as the entire digital world dissolved into blinding, agonizing white fire. And then, I was falling. I slammed back into my physical body with the grace of a crashed hovercar. My back hit the wet concrete floor of the shack. The physical heavy neural cable was ripped from my neck as I fell. The real world rushed back in, the smell of rain, the cold air, the deafening silence. Gideon's massive body collapsed to its knees right beside me. The hand cannon slipped from his fingers, clattering uselessly to the floor. The terrifying red glow in his eyes was completely gone. His silver irises were clear, dilated, and entirely human. He was gasping for air, his chest heaving as the aftermarket optical drive hummed furiously to keep up with his pounding heart. Jax, he choked out, his voice a ruined, raw rasp. He crawled forward, his massive, trembling hands reaching out to hover over me, afraid to touch, afraid he had broken me. I tried to sit up. I tried to deliver a perfectly timed, snarky one-liner about how he owed me dinner for the brain damage. But my body refused to obey. A warm, thick liquid dripped down my chin. I weakly reached up to wipe it away. My fingers came back stained with bright red blood. It was pouring from my nose. The neural feedback had severely ruptured the capillaries in my brain. The edges of my vision rapidly darkened, closing in like a physical tunnel. Jax, Gideon's voice cracked in absolute, unadulterated panic. He lunged forward, gathering my limp body into his massive arms, pulling me against his armored chest. Jax, look at me. Stay with me. I could feel the frantic, terrified thud of his heart, the heart I fixed beating against my cheek. I managed a weak, blood-stained smirk. Told you. I'd fix you, I slurred, my vocal cords barely working. You fool. You beautiful, reckless fool, Gideon begged, his hand pressing desperately against the bleeding port on my neck. Do not leave me in the dark. Not after you just showed me the light. I wanted to tell him it was just a little neural shock, that I'd bounce back. But the darkness was too heavy. The last thing I felt before my consciousness completely shut down was the sensation of something hot and wet dropping onto my cheek. The Paladin Inquisitor was crying. Waking up from a neural feedback overload doesn't feel like waking up at all. It feels like being slowly dragged out of a frozen swamp by your teeth. The first thing I registered was the steady, rhythmic drumming of acid rain against a corrugated tin roof. The second was the dull, throbbing agony at the base of my skull, radiating outward like a spiderweb of shattered glass behind my eyes. I groaned a pathetic, gravelly sound that tore at my raw throat. I tried to shift my weight, but my limbs felt like they were cast in wet concrete. Do not move. The voice was a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated directly against my spine. It wasn't the robotic, static-laced drone of the Paladin Inquisitor, nor was it the terrifying, dead tone of the Purge virus. It was entirely, breathtakingly human. I forced my heavy eyelids open. The world was a blurry, magenta-tinted smear, but as my optical nerves slowly recalibrated, the shape above me came into focus. I wasn't lying on the freezing, wet concrete floor of the atmospheric shack anymore. I was elevated, resting on a makeshift bed of heavy canvas tarps. And I wasn't alone. Gideon was sitting, cross-legged on the floor right beside me, my head resting heavily in his lap. He had completely discarded the ruined, blood-stained remnants of his white and gold trench coat. He was stripped down to his dark synthetic undershirt, the fabric torn away to expose the massive, scarred expanse of his chest, and the intricate cybernetic plating I had painstakingly repaired. His silver eyes were locked onto my face. The terrifying, empty void that had consumed him during the virus attack was completely gone. His irises were clear dilated and blazing with an intensity that practically sucked the oxygen out of the tiny room. He was looking at me like I was the only fixed point of gravity in a collapsing universe. "Hey," I croaked, trying to swallow the dry, metallic taste of copper in my mouth. I raised a trembling hand to my face, my fingers brushing against dried, crusty blood under my nose. "Did we win?" Gideon didn't smile, but a profound, shuddering sigh of relief escaped his chest. He caught my trembling hand in his massive one, his calloused fingers wrapping around mine with agonizing gentleness. He brought my knuckles to his lips, pressing a firm, lingering kiss against my bruised skin. "We survived," he murmured, the vibration of his voice sending a sudden, electric jolt straight to my core. "Because of you. You tore the church's algorithm to pieces from the inside out." "Yeah, well," I rasped, letting my hand rest in his grip, too exhausted to put my sarcastic armor back on. "I told you, I don't leave jobs unfinished." I tried to push myself up on my elbows, but a sudden, sharp ache flared deep inside my chest. It wasn't the neural pain in my head. It was a strange, phantom throb right over my heart, I gasped, my free hand instinctively flying to my sternum. But the strange thing was, the moment I felt the ache, Gideon flinched. His free hand mirrored my exact movement, pressing flat against the center of his own massive, cybernetic chest. I blinked the fuzzy, fragmented memories of the digital cathedral, slowly piecing themselves back together. The firewall breaking, the localized format, the desperate need to anchor his identity to something real before the virus deleted his mind. "Oh," I breathed out, my eyes widening as I stared at his chest. "I really did that, didn't I?" Gideon followed my gaze. Right above the primary pump of his artificial heart, cutting through the pristine silver plating, was a fresh, jagged weld mark. It was ugly, frantic, and decidedly non-regulation. "When the virus began to fragment my core systems, you didn't just share your memories, Jax," Gideon said, his voice dropping into a low, reverent whisper. "You fundamentally altered my architecture. You spliced a piece of your own hardware into my survival drive." "It's a biorhythmic tether," I admitted, my voice shaking slightly as the reality of what I had done set in. "A piece of my localized neural microchip. The virus was designed to consume data until the host heart stopped. So, I hardwired your artificial heart directly to my biological pulse. As long as my heart is beating, your core recognizes that you are alive. It locked the virus out completely. I had tethered his life directly to mine. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a permanent, physical reality. Every time my heart beat, a microscopic electrical signal fired directly into the center of his chest, commanding his cybernetics to follow the exact same rhythm. I had marked him. I had claimed a paladin. Gideon didn't look angry. He didn't look violated. He looked at me with a devotion so absolute, so overwhelmingly profound, that it made my breath hitch. He took my hand, the one resting on my own chest, and gently pulled it toward him. He pressed my palm flat against the jagged weld mark over his artificial heart. Beneath the cold steel, I could feel the heavy, concussive thud-thud of his primary pump. It was beating in perfect, flawless synchronization with my own pulse. "I feel you," Gideon whispered, his silver eyes burning into mine. "Every second, every breath. It is not just an override, Jax. It is an anchor. For 11 years, the church told me I was a weapon forged in holy fire. They stripped away my humanity piece by piece and replaced it with cold certainty. But this, he pressed his own massive hand over mine, trapping my fingers against his chest. This is the first time in my life I have felt truly alive, he vowed, his voice thick with raw emotion. I am no longer a sword of the singularity. I am yours. The words hung in the damp, heavy air of the shack. They weren't spoken with the frantic desperation of a dying man. They were spoken with the terrifying, unshakable certainty of an apex predator making a permanent decree. For the first time in 26 years, my sharp tongue completely failed me. My sarcastic deflections, my street-smart cynicism, it all melted away under the sheer, unadulterated heat of his gaze. I looked at the giant, lethal man holding my hand against his chest, and I realized I was entirely, hopelessly compromised. You are a terrifyingly dramatic toaster. You know that? I finally managed to whisper a weak, genuine smile breaking across my face. Gideon's lips curled into a devastatingly handsome smirk. Your toaster. He leaned down. There was no hesitation this time. His mouth found mine. The kiss was a collision. It wasn't tentative, it was consuming. It tasted like blood ozone and the bitter tang of the rain, but beneath it all was a searing, desperate heat. My hands instinctively tangled in his dark hair, pulling him closer, chasing the overwhelming warmth of his massive body. His arms wrapped completely around my waist, lifting me slightly off the canvas, shielding me, claiming me. The biorhythmic tether in our chests pulsed rapidly, a synchronized drumbeat of adrenaline and pure, unfiltered desire. For a single, perfect minute, the miserable, toxic world of the cyber bios completely ceased to exist. And then, the world violently kicked the door back in. The rusted metal wall on the far side of the shack didn't just break, it completely vaporized. A blinding, searing flash of white light illuminated the dark tunnel, followed immediately by a concussive shockwave that threw us both backward. I hit the concrete floor hard, my ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. Target localized, thermal shields holding, a synthesized, heavily amplified voice boomed from the darkness outside the massive hole in the wall. Through the pouring acid rain and the thick, billowing smoke I saw them. 3 heavy combat mechs, towering 8 feet tall, painted in the pristine, terrifying white and gold of the Singularity Church. Their heavy plasma cannons were spinning up, glowing with lethal blue energy, aimed directly at our tiny, collapsing sanctuary. And standing behind them, shielded by an umbrella of hard light energy, was a figure draped in elaborate, glowing cybernetic robes. High Bishop Malachi. Paladin Gideon, the High Bishop's voice echoed through the bayou, amplified by a dozen external speakers, dripping with absolute, condescending venom. You have fallen to heresy. You have allowed a sewer rat to corrupt your holy vessel. How profoundly disappointing. Gideon didn't panic. He didn't scramble for cover. He slowly stood up. The massive, lethal Paladin Inquisitor rose to his full height, completely eclipsing the light from the mechs. The terrifying, serene grace of the apex predator had returned, but this time, it wasn't bound by the church's algorithms. It was fueled entirely by his own free will, and the synchronized heartbeat pounding in his chest. He reached down, grabbing his heavy kinetic hand, cannon from the floor with one hand, and effortlessly hauling me to my feet with the other. He pulled me seamlessly behind his broad back, positioning his massive, armored body as a physical shield between me and the entire holy army. I am not corrupted Malachi, Gideon's deep voice roared back, vibrating with a lethal, terrifying promise that made the combat mechs visibly hesitate. I am unplugged. Gideon cocked the hand cannon. The sound was a loud, definitive metallic clack that echoed over the rain. He glanced back at me over his shoulder, his silver eyes flashing with a dangerous, exhilarating fire. Stay behind me, he ordered. I wiped a smear of blood from my chin, pulling my plasma pistol from its holster, my own heart hammering a furious, synchronized battle rhythm. Not a chance, Paladin, I smirked, stepping out from behind him, raising my gun to stand shoulder to shoulder with the most dangerous man in the city. We shoot together. Purge the heretics, High Bishop Malachi ordered. His voice lacked the booming, synthesized theater from a moment ago. It was just cold, bureaucratic murder. The 3 massive combat mechs opened fire. In the past, my survival strategy for dealing with heavy plasma artillery involved running, hiding, and crying internally, but tonight, everything was different. Because the second before the mechs squeezed their triggers, a sharp, electric jolt fired through the biorhythmic tether in my chest. I didn't just see Gideon move. I felt his tactical processor mapping the trajectory of the incoming fire. I felt the surge of his artificial adrenaline as it synchronized perfectly with my own hammering pulse. I knew exactly where he was going to be before his boots even left the concrete. I dropped to my knees a fraction of a second before a massive blast of blue plasma tore through the space where my head had just been. Gideon didn't dodge. He launched himself directly into the crossfire. Without the church's algorithmic limiters holding his cybernetics back, the Paladin moved with a speed that defied the laws of physics. He closed the 30-foot gap between us and the first mech in the blink of an eye. The machine tried to track him, its heavy cannons swiveling, but Gideon was already inside its guard. He didn't use his hand cannon. He used his bare hands. His massive fingers dug directly into the reinforced titanium plating of the mech's knee joint. With a guttural roar that vibrated the rainwater around us, Gideon violently twisted. The sound of screaming metal was deafening, as he literally tore the mech's leg off its chassis. The 8-foot machine toppled forward, crashing into the toxic mud of the bayou. "One down," I yelled, not staying idle. The second mech locked its targeting lasers onto Gideon's exposed back. My chest tightened, the tether transmitting a flash of incoming danger. "I've got your 6, I shouted. I didn't shoot it. A plasma pistol against heavy armor was like throwing rocks at a tank. Instead, I sprinted to the left, sliding through the mud, and ripped a heavy EMP-laced disruption grenade from my belt. But I didn't throw it at the mech. I threw it at the submerged, highly conductive power relay cable running through the shallow water beneath its feet. The grenade detonated. The electrified water supercharged the blast, sending a massive, localized electromagnetic shockwave directly up the mech's legs. Its optical sensors violently sparked and went dark. It froze, completely paralyzed. Gideon didn't even look back to check if I had handled it. He already knew. The tether pulsed with absolute, unshakable trust. He used the paralyzed mech as a springboard, vaulting off its shoulders to launch himself directly at the third machine. He leveled his heavy kinetic hand cannon midair and fired point-blank into the third mech's optical cluster. The recoil would have shattered a normal man's arm, but Gideon landed with terrifying grace as the machine's head exploded in a shower of sparks and synthetic fluid. "You are fighting like a feral beast," Gideon, High Bishop Malachi spat, stepping backward as his mechanical escort was reduced to smoking scrap in less than 20 seconds. The High Bishop raised his hands. The elaborate cybernetic rings on his fingers glowed blindingly bright, and a massive, domed hard light energy shield projected outward, encasing him in an impenetrable, glowing bubble. "You think a street rat and a broken paladin can dismantle the divine algorithm?" Malachi sneered, his voice amplified by the shield's acoustics. "You have severed your connection to the light. You will die in the dark, bleeding in the mud like the rest of the unwashed masses." Gideon walked slowly toward the energy dome, his silver eyes completely devoid of mercy. His white and gold trench coat was gone, replaced by the dark, scarred reality of his cybernetics. "I am not in the dark, Malachi," Gideon rumbled, his voice low and lethal. He raised a hand, pointing a single, massive finger not at the bishop, but back at me. "I brought my own light. I was already moving. You can't punch through a High Bishop's hard light shield. It's designed to withstand orbital bombardment. But a shield is just a program, and a program needs a local network to sustain itself." While Gideon stood in front of the dome, drawing Malachi's absolute, terrified attention, I was currently crouched behind the smoking ruins of the first mech he had destroyed. I had ripped the access panel off the down machine and spliced my neural sync cable directly into its communication array. My fingers flew across the holographic keyboard projected from my wrist pad. I was riding the adrenaline high of a lifetime, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm that I could feel echoing in Gideon's chest 30 feet away. "Warning, unauthorized network intrusion detected," the bishop's automated defense system announced. "Shut up," I muttered, aggressively typing lines of malicious code. I was using the downed mech's high-tier military clearance to backdoor my way into the bishop's personal area network. "Come on, you holy piece of trash. Give me the firewall." Inside the dome, Malachi panicked. He drew a plasma whip from his belt, the weapon crackling with lethal energy, but he couldn't attack without lowering his own shield. He was trapped in his own perfect defense. "What is he doing?" Malachi screamed at Gideon, his composure entirely cracking. "Stop him." Gideon just smirked, a devastatingly dark, arrogant expression that I absolutely planned on kissing later. "You wanted to execute my mechanic. Now, you get to watch him work." "Got it," I yelled. I hit the execute command. The hard light shield protecting the High Bishop didn't shatter. It simply blinked out of existence, accompanied by the sad, descending chime of a corrupted operating system. Malachi was entirely exposed. He lashed out with the plasma whip in a desperate, frantic arc aiming for Gideon's neck. But Gideon was already moving. The tether in my chest flared hot as his combat processors calculated the exact speed of the whip. He ducked the searing plasma, stepping inside the High Bishop's guard. With his left hand, Gideon grabbed Malachi's wrist, crushing the delicate cybernetics until the bishop dropped the whip with a scream of agony. With his right hand, Gideon drove his armored fist directly into the center of the High Bishop's chest. It wasn't a punch. It was an extraction. Gideon's fingers pierced the elaborate ceremonial armor, sinking deep into the bishop's chassis. Malachi gasped, his eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated horror as the paladin he had ordered to be executed held his life in his hands. "The algorithm requires fuel," Gideon whispered, his voice vibrating with the weight of thousands of harvested souls. Consider this a donation." With a brutal, effortless pull, Gideon ripped his arm back. He didn't just pull out wires. He ripped out the High Bishop's primary energy core, a glowing, pulsing orb of pure, concentrated power. Malachi's eyes went completely dark. His body crumpled to the wet concrete like a puppet with its strings cut, splashing into the toxic puddles of the cyber bayous. It was over. The apex predator of the church was dead. Gideon stood over the body, his chest heaving, the rain washing the dark synthetic fluids from his armored arms. He crushed the glowing core in his massive hand, letting the shattered pieces fall into the mud. He turned to look at me, the tether between us settling into a steady, victorious rhythm. "You okay?" I asked, panting heavily as I unplugged my cable from the down mech. "I am optimal," Gideon replied, his silver eyes softening instantly as they locked onto mine. "Are you injured?" "Just my pride, considering you got to do the cool finishing move," I smirked, walking over to him. I stopped right in front of the dead bishop, looking down at his elaborate, glowing robes. "But the night isn't over yet." "Jax," Gideon asked, stepping closer, his presence immediately radiating a comforting, grounding heat in the freezing rain. "What are you doing?" "He's a high bishop," I said, a wicked, vindictive grin spreading across my face. "Which means his personal network has unrestricted, backdoor access to the city's primary broadcast grid." I knelt down, plugging my neural sync cable directly into the port on the back of Malachi's lifeless neck. I pulled up the encrypted data file Gideon had risked his life to steal, the source code, the ledger proving the church was harvesting human souls to feed their AI god. "They wanted to broadcast our execution to prove a point," I said, my fingers flying across the holographic keys, bypassing the final, dead firewalls of the church's network. "Let's give New Orleans a different kind of sermon." I hit the global upload button. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. And then, every single neon sign, every massive holographic billboard, and every corporate advertisement screen stretching across the towering skyline of the upper city violently flickered. The endless stream of luxury commercials and holy propaganda vanished. In their place, lines of raw, undeniable data began to scroll. Audio logs of the High Bishop ordering the mass digitalization of the poor. Video feeds of the secret harvesting facilities beneath the Grand Cathedral. The absolute, unvarnished truth of the divine algorithm, broadcasted in maximum resolution to 30 million people simultaneously. I unplugged my cable, standing up and wiping the rain from my eyes. I looked up at the towering skyscrapers of New Orleans, watching the city realize its gods were monsters. The distant, chaotic roar of a million voices rising in outrage began to echo down into the bayous. The revolution had started, and it hadn't cost us a single drop of our own blood. Gideon stepped up behind me, his massive arm wrapped around my waist, pulling my back flush against his broad, solid chest. I leaned back into his warmth, resting my hand over his on my stomach. The synchronized heartbeat thudded reassuringly between us. "The empire is falling," Gideon murmured, watching the lights of the city shift and change. "Let it burn," I replied softly, turning my head to look up at the paladin who was finally, entirely mine. "We have a workshop to rebuild." 3 weeks. That was exactly how long it took for a 300-year-old, heavily militarized religious empire to completely and catastrophically collapse. When the broadcast hit the upper city, I expected riots. I expected chaos. What I didn't expect was absolute, unified annihilation. The citizens of New Orleans, the ones who had been bleeding their wallets and their souls dry to feed the Singularity Church, didn't just protest. They tore the Grand Cathedral apart brick by holy brick. For 3 weeks, the sky above the city burned with a strange, beautiful orange glow, masking the usual oppressive smog. I watched it all from the relative safety of the French Quarter slums, sitting on the roof of my partially submerged workshop, eating synthetic jambalaya and watching the false gods fall. But I didn't participate in the final siege. I had my own mess to clean up. You know, for a supposedly high-tech plasma welder, you have the structural integrity of wet cardboard, I muttered, kicking the heavy hydraulic door of my shop. I was currently wrestling with the reinforced steel entrance, the exact same door that a certain bleeding paladin had, violently blown off its hinges nearly a month ago. The neon signs from the street above flickered their usual violent magenta, casting long, dramatic shadows across the rusted metal and the deep puddles of the alleyway. The air still smelled heavily of ozone and battery acid, but for the first time in years, the suffocating presence of church patrol drones was entirely gone. I wiped a streak of grease from my forehead, tossing my wrench onto the workbench inside. I had spent the last 20 days rebuilding the shop, clearing out the ruined tech, and restoring my illegal grid. It was quiet, it was peaceful, and I hated it. The quiet meant I could hear my own heartbeat. And every time my heart beat, the biorhythmic tether in my chest pulsed with a faint, phantom echo of a massive, cybernetic core miles away. Gideon hadn't stayed in the bayous after we killed High Bishop Malachi. He couldn't. The broadcast had lit the match, but someone needed to direct the fire. For the last 3 weeks, he had been at the forefront of the rebellion, using his intimate knowledge of the church's security grids to systematically dismantle the divine algorithms. Mainframe. He was leading a war, and I was fixing a door. It made sense. We were a power couple in the truest sense. He broke the empire, and I made sure our home was still standing when he got back. But the waiting was starting to gnaw at my usually ironclad patience. I picked up a rag, aggressively wiping the oil from my hands. If that oversized toaster doesn't drag his heavy metal chassis back here by tomorrow, I'm going to march up to the cathedral and manually reboot his. Heavy boots echoed on the concrete stairs behind me. I stopped. The rag slipped from my fingers, dropping to the floor. The biorhythmic tether in my chest didn't just pulse. It flared hot a sudden, rushing surge of adrenaline and absolute, unwavering calm that didn't belong to me. I turned around. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the flickering magenta neon of the street, was Gideon. He looked entirely different. The pristine, terrifying white and gold armor of the Paladin Inquisitor was completely gone. The heavy, ceremonial trench coat had been discarded. Instead, he was wearing a simple, dark synthetic leather jacket over a black shirt that stretched taut across his massive, heavily scarred chest. His dark hair was slightly longer, damp from the acid rain, falling carelessly over his forehead. Without the holy armor, the true extent of his cybernetics was visible. The silver plating weaving seamlessly into his human skin, the faint, internal glow of his aftermarket heart. He didn't look like a weapon of the church anymore. He looked like a man, a dangerous, devastatingly breathtaking man. "Is the shop open?" Gideon asked, his deep, resonant baritone vibrating through the damp, sending an immediate, familiar shiver down my spine. I leaned against the workbench, crossing my arms over my chest to hide the slight tremble in my hands. I forced my signature, sarcastic smirk onto my face. "Depends," I replied, looking him up and down. I usually charge double for former religious zealots, especially the ones who still owe me a front door. Gideon stepped fully into the workshop, the heavy thud of his boots entirely grounding me. His silver eyes were clear, completely devoid of the chaotic, corrupted red code that had nearly consumed him. He looked around the rebuilt space, taking in the organized tools, the humming servers, and the distinct lack of blood on the floor. "I believe I have repaid the debt of the door," Gideon said smoothly, stopping a few feet away from me. "I tore the central AI from its mainframe this morning. I crushed its processing core with my bare hands. The divine algorithm is dead jacks. The church is officially gone." The weight of his words settled over the room. 300 years of oppression, of stolen souls and digitized nightmares, ended by the very weapon they had forged to protect it. "Well," I breathed out, the smirk fading into a look of profound, genuine awe. "I guess that covers the property damage." "Barely." Gideon didn't laugh, but the corners of his eyes crinkled with a profound, quiet warmth. He took another step closer. The sheer, radiating heat of his massive body immediately chased away the damp chill of the bio. "The war is over," Gideon murmured, his gaze dropping to my lips before rising to meet my eyes. The absolute certainty that usually carried his voice was suddenly replaced by a raw, unguarded vulnerability. "I have no commanders. I have no holy crusade. For the first time in my existence, I have nowhere to report to." He was laying his soul completely bare. The apex predator, the giant of steel and flesh, was standing in a messy, grease-stained garage, asking for a place to belong. I uncrossed my arms. I didn't deflect. I didn't use a snarky one-liner to shield myself from the overwhelming gravity of the moment. I pushed off the workbench and walked toward the back corner of the shop. "Good thing I did some remodeling," I said quietly. I stopped in front of a wide, empty space I had meticulously cleared out over the last 3 weeks. I had moved my heaviest server racks, completely rearranged my tool stations, and set up a massive, reinforced charging alcove lined with high-grade synthetic oil reserves and heavy-duty maintenance cables. Gideon followed me, his silver eyes widening slightly as he looked at the space. It was specifically, undeniably designed for someone exactly his size. "Your shoulders are entirely too wide for my old layout," I explained, my voice softening, entirely stripped of its usual abrasive edge. I turned to face him, looking up into his striking face. "And your aftermarket heart requires regular tune-ups. You don't need a god to tell you where to report to Gideon. You never did. You just needed a mechanic." Gideon stared at the empty space, and then he looked down at me. The tether connecting our chests pulsed, a heavy, synchronized thud-thud that echoed the exact moment his realization matched mine. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He closed the distance between us in a fraction of a second. His massive, calloused hands reached out, gripping my waist with an effortless, desperate strength, and lifted me completely off the ground. He spun, pressing my back against the nearest steel workbench, lifting me until I was sitting on the edge of it. He stepped directly between my thighs, boxing me in entirely, his broad chest pressing flush against mine. "Jax," he breathed, the word a heavy, devoted vow against my lips. "Gideon," I whispered back, my hands instantly flying up to tangle in his damp, dark hair. His mouth crashed into mine. There was no hesitation, no holding back, no impending threat of a virus or an execution to interrupt us. It was a kiss of absolute, primitive claiming. He tasted like rain ozone and intoxicating freedom. I opened my mouth, letting him deepen the kiss a soft, involuntary moan, escaping my throat as the sheer heat of his cybernetic body seeped into my skin. His heavy hands mapped the curve of my spine, dragging me impossibly closer. I wrapped my legs around his thick waist, anchoring myself to him as the world spun. The biorhythmic tether flared with blinding intensity. Every beat of my heart was met with the exact, identical heavy thud of his mechanical core against my chest. We weren't just touching, we were entirely, flawlessly synchronized. When he finally pulled back, we were both gasping for air. He didn't go far. He buried his face in the crook of my neck his heavy, shuddering breaths sending electric chills down my spine. "I am yours," Gideon rumbled against my pulse point, his arms tightening around me like a permanent shield. "In this life, and whatever remains of my soul, yours." I wrapped my arms around his broad shoulders, resting my cheek against his dark hair. I looked past him, out the open doorway of my shop, watching the acid rain fall in sheets under the magenta neon lights of the fractured city. The world above us was still a mess. There would be power vacuums, corporate wars, and a million broken things to fix in the aftermath of the church's fall. But as I felt the steady, unwavering, synchronized heartbeat pounding between our chests, I knew I didn't care. I was a street rat who fixed broken machines, and I had just claimed the most dangerous, beautiful piece of hardware on the planet. I know I smiled, pressing a soft kiss to his temple. Now shut up and let me enjoy my newly renovated shop. The paladin was dead. The man was alive, and he was finally entirely mine.